The silence that followed the discovery was the particular silence of a group of people who have collectively witnessed something that exists outside the bounds of their ordinary experience. The village of Ashford in the Vale had not had a murder in living memory. There had been accidents, certainly, and Mrs. Pemberton's unfortunate decision to take her own life in 1987. But nothing that fell into the category of violent death inflicted by another human hand. For a moment, perhaps 5 seconds, the assembled guests simply stared at the body of Jonathan Cross with the blank incomprehension of those confronted with the impossible made suddenly, undeniably real. Then the moment fractured, and human nature reasserted itself in all its complicated urgency. Dr. Blackwood was the first to move with any purpose, stepping past Miss Marple with a quiet "excuse me, madam," and proceeding directly to the body. He checked for a pulse with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this action hundreds of times before, though the pallor of Jonathan Cross's face and the quantity of blood surrounding his head suggested the gesture was largely academic. After perhaps 30 seconds, he straightened and turned to face the assembled crowd, his expression grave. "He's been dead for some time," he said quietly. "At least 2 hours, I should say. Perhaps longer." This pronouncement seemed to crystallize the reality of the situation, and almost immediately someone, it was Gerald Hartwell, with the authority of his legal background, suggested that someone telephone the police. Miss Marple found herself standing quietly to one side of the summer house entrance, her small frame somehow managing to occupy space without seeming intrusive. She watched as the various members of the gathering began the process of fragmenting into smaller clusters, each group processing the shock through conversation, through the ancient human mechanism of talking through trauma. Sophie Venn had stopped screaming and was instead sitting on one of the garden benches, her face an interesting shade of gray, while Patricia Ashford stood nearby offering her water in a tone that suggested she was performing an expected social duty rather than acting from any genuine concern. Margaret Finch was pacing, her hands clasped before her, her lips moving in what appeared to be a recitation of facts, as though arranging the morning's events into a logical sequence might somehow make them less horrifying. It was Richard Ashford, however, who captured Miss Marple's attention, though she gave no outward sign of the intensity with which she observed him. He had moved to stand near the edge of the garden, ostensibly to give space to Dr. Blackwood and the body. But his eyes kept returning to the summer house with an expression that suggested something beyond mere shock or morbid curiosity. There was something in his face that reminded Miss Marple of a calculation being performed, of information being rapidly processed and filed away. When his mother approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder, he started noticeably, as though she had awakened him from a trance. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds before he excused himself and walked toward the back of the garden, disappearing from view behind the hydrangea stand. The police arrived some 40 minutes later, which was considerably faster than anyone might have expected, though in retrospect this was hardly surprising given that the village's police station was located barely 2 miles away on the road toward the market town. Inspector James Hawthorne was a man in his early 50s with the kind of methodical bearing that suggested he had spent considerable time organizing information into manageable sequences. He arrived with a sergeant named Willis, a younger man with sandy hair and the eager expression of someone still relatively early in a career he approached with genuine enthusiasm. They established a perimeter around the summer house with the assistance of a third officer who had driven them from the station. And then Hawthorne began the process of interviewing the guests. It was during this process that various interesting details began to emerge, almost entirely by accident. Dr. Blackwood mentioned, while discussing when he had last seen Jonathan Cross alive, that he had passed him on the road to Ashford not 2 hours before the party, and that Jonathan had been driving his car rather faster than road conditions warranted, suggesting he had been in something of a state of agitation. Margaret Finch, when asked if she had noticed anything unusual, reported that she had seen Jonathan arrive at the party only briefly, perhaps 20 minutes into the proceedings, and that he had spoken to no one before retreating toward the summer house. Patricia Ashford found it necessary to mention that Jonathan had recently been involved in a rather contentious business dispute with her son Richard regarding some property development they had been jointly pursuing, though she hastened to add that these things were quite common in business and hardly the sort of matter that would lead to violence. Miss Marple, when her turn came to offer her observations, and it came relatively late in the process, as though the police had somehow ranked her last in importance, provided only the barest facts. She had been sitting under the apple tree when the screaming occurred. She had not seen Jonathan Cross arrive, though she believed Dr. Blackwood's account seemed reliable. She had not noticed anything unusual about the morning, though she did remark, almost as an afterthought, that she had observed someone moving hurriedly past the hydrangeas approximately 40 minutes before the discovery, though in the excitement she had not thought to pay particular attention to who it might have been. Inspector Hawthorne thanked her politely and seemed to dismiss her from his mind almost immediately, which was precisely what Miss Marple had anticipated. Very few people ever suspected that the elderly village woman sitting quietly beneath garden trees might be the single most observant person present at any given gathering. By the time evening had settled over Ashford in the Vale, the village had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. The ordinary rhythms of summer life, the closing of shops, the preparation of evening meals, the routine of domestic comfort, continued as they always did. Yet beneath these familiar patterns ran an undercurrent of speculation and unease that seemed to permeate the very air. The Hartwell garden party had concluded, the guests dispersed to their various homes, the body of Jonathan Cross removed by the appropriate authorities to the county mortuary for examination. Inspector Hawthorne had established a temporary office in the village's small police station, and it had already become clear that this would not be a matter quickly resolved and filed away in administrative folders. Jonathan Cross, it transpired, had been a far more complicated man than his outward respectability had suggested, and his death would open doors to secrets that the village had collectively preferred to keep closed. The initial assumption among the police and among much of the village population was that Richard Ashford represented the obvious suspect. The business dispute between him and Jonathan was well documented, having been the subject of considerable gossip when it had first emerged some 6 months previous. The property in question was a Victorian terrace house in the center of the village, currently occupied by Mrs. Eleanor Graves, a widow of advanced years who had inherited it from her late husband. Jonathan Cross had made an offer to purchase it for development purposes, planning to convert it into luxury flats that would appeal to the affluent residents of the surrounding counties who wished for weekend retreats within easy driving distance of London. Richard Ashford had been asked to join the venture as an associate developer, but the two men had disagreed fundamentally about the architectural approach. Jonathan wanted a modern conversion that maximized profit and efficiency. Richard preferred a restoration that would preserve the building's historical character. The argument had become bitter, and Richard had eventually withdrawn from the project entirely, taking with him certain financial commitments that had placed Jonathan in an awkward position with Mrs. Eleanor Graves. What made Richard's position even more suspicious, at least to those inclined toward such thinking, was that he had inherited his mother's considerable wealth and business interests only 2 years previous, and there were those in the village who suggested that the younger generation often lacked the patience for the slow accumulation of fortune. His return to Ashford had been somewhat mysterious, marked by a reserve that he had not previously demonstrated. He had taken a position as an independent consultant in architectural preservation, work that seemed to satisfy him intellectually but provided little in the way of immediate financial return. More significantly, there were whispers, the kind of whispers that move through villages like water through porous soil, that his time in London had ended badly, that there had been professional difficulties and perhaps romantic entanglement that had resulted in his rather hasty retreat to the safety of his childhood home. Miss Marple, sitting in her small cottage on Willow Lane, found these speculations interesting, though ultimately incomplete. She had poured herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite armchair with her knitting, a cardigan in a soft blue wool that she had been working on for some weeks, and her mind moved backward through the afternoon with the methodical precision of someone rewinding a film reel frame by frame. She considered the various guests, their reactions, their movements, the small details that most people would have dismissed as insignificant. She thought about Patricia Ashford's proprietary behavior toward her son, the way her hand had remained on his shoulder just slightly longer than necessary. She thought about Sophie Venn's scream, which had been genuine enough, though there had been something almost performative in its continuation, as though the younger woman had been allowing herself to experience the full theatrical potential of the moment. She thought about Dr. Blackwood's pallor, which had nothing to do with the shock of discovery and everything to do with whatever personal knowledge he possessed about Jonathan Cross. The knock on her door came at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, just as she was finishing the sleeve of her cardigan. It was Constance Hartwell, still visibly shaken, though she had managed to restore herself to something resembling composure. She was accompanied by Gerald, who looked as though he had spent the intervening hours reviewing legal precedents in his mind. They had come, Constance explained, because they felt troubled by something that had occurred to her only after the police had completed their initial interviews. Jonathan Cross had telephoned the house that very morning, asking if he might attend the party. This had been unusual, as Jonathan typically did not attend purely social gatherings, preferring the more structured environment of club meetings or professional functions. More significantly, he had asked specifically if Richard Ashford would be present. When Constance had confirmed that he would be, Jonathan had hesitated for several seconds before confirming that he would attend. "It seemed to me," Constance said, her hands twisting slightly in her lap, "that Jonathan wanted to speak with Richard about something." There was a quality to his voice that suggested urgency, perhaps even desperation. I wondered if I should mention this to the inspector, but I did not want to cause further trouble for Richard, and I thought perhaps it was none of my business. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care and regarded her visitor with the gentle attentiveness that had made her such an effective listener throughout her long life. "Did Jonathan seem angry?" she asked quietly. "No," Constance replied after consideration. Troubled would be the better word. As though something had occurred to him that had altered his perception of matters. As though he had come to understand something that he had previously been blind to. Miss Marple nodded slowly, filing this observation away with the others, feeling the shape of the puzzle beginning to shift and reorganize itself in her mind. The truth, she suspected, was far more complicated than anyone currently imagined, and it would require not forensic evidence or physical proof, but rather a careful understanding of human motivation and the particular ways that people constructed their lives around kernels of genuine feeling. The morning after the murder dawned with the peculiar clarity that sometimes follows trauma, as though the universe had adjusted its focus to render every detail in sharp relief. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and spent the first hour of daylight attending to her garden, a ritual that had sustained her through decades of life's complications. The roses required deadheading, and there were weeds that had begun their inevitable incursion into the herbaceous borders, and these small tasks occupied her hands while her mind continued its methodical work of reconstruction and analysis. By the time she had changed into her day clothes and prepared her breakfast, the village had already begun its process of fragmentation, dividing itself into those who believed Richard Ashford guilty and those who harbored doubts, with the lines between these positions shifting constantly as new information circulated through the established channels of village gossip. Inspector Hawthorne had spent the previous evening conducting interviews and establishing timelines, and by morning had arrived at several preliminary conclusions that he shared with his sergeant in the small office they had commandeered at the police station. Jonathan Cross had been struck on the back of the head with the bronze paperweight, a blow that would have rendered him unconscious almost immediately and dead within a matter of minutes. The weapon bore no fingerprints, having been wiped clean with something, likely a handkerchief or piece of cloth, before being left at the scene. The time of death, according to Dr. Blackwood's estimates, fell somewhere between 1 o'clock and 2:30 in the afternoon, which placed it squarely within the time frame of the garden party. This meant that the murderer had very likely been present at the gathering, had lured Jonathan to the summer house, and had killed him with a weapon that had been lying loose on a table in Constance Hartwell's study, accessible to any guest who had wandered into the house. What troubled Inspector Hawthorne, though he did not articulate this concern to his sergeant, was the question of motive and opportunity intertwined. Richard Ashford certainly had motive. The business dispute, the financial complications, the apparent humiliation of being forced to withdraw from a project. But did he have the cold-blooded capability to strike down a man in broad daylight at a social gathering? The inspector had interviewed hundreds of suspects in his career, and he had learned that murderers often bore a particular quality that was difficult to name but easy to recognize once you had developed an eye for it, a certain hardness beneath the surface, a capacity for compartmentalization that allowed them to function in society even as they harbored violent intentions. Richard Ashford, when questioned, had seemed genuinely distraught about Jonathan's death. He had wept, not dramatically but with the quiet intensity of someone processing genuine grief, which seemed inconsistent with the behavior of a man who had just killed his business rival. The interview that troubled Miss Marple, when she heard an account of it through the village's informal communication network, was not Richard Ashford's, but rather that of Dr. Edward Blackwood. The doctor had been somewhat defensive when questioned about his relationship with Jonathan Cross, and had eventually admitted, under gentle but persistent questioning, that Jonathan had come to him 3 weeks previous with symptoms of a cardiac nature that had alarmed him considerably. Jonathan had been experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath, and Dr. Blackwood had recommended that he consult a specialist in the city for further evaluation. What was interesting, according to the account that had filtered through village gossip via Mrs. Eleanor Graves, who had overheard the inspector discussing the matter with his sergeant, was that Jonathan had expressed considerable anxiety about undergoing the necessary tests. He had seemed, according to the doctor's characterization, almost frightened of what the tests might reveal. This detail lodged itself in Miss Marple's mind with the persistence of a splinter, small but irritating and difficult to ignore. A man with serious health concerns was a man with complicated motivations, a man whose behavior might be driven by fear or desperation rather than the simple emotions that typically motivated violent crime. She found herself wondering what Jonathan Cross might have discovered about his health, and how that discovery might have altered his plans and intentions. She wondered, too, about the property dispute with Richard Ashford, whether it had been fundamentally about architectural philosophy or whether it had concealed some deeper disagreement rooted in Jonathan's sense of his own mortality. By midday, the village had been thoroughly disrupted. Inspector Hawthorne had requested that all the guests at the garden party remain available for further questioning, which meant that many of the village's most prominent residents found themselves essentially confined to the area, unable to pursue their normal routines without the consciousness of being persons of interest in a murder investigation. This restriction seemed to amplify the undercurrents of tension and resentment that typically lay dormant beneath Ashford's placid surface. Patricia Ashford had closed her house to all visitors, claiming she required privacy to support her son during this difficult time. Sophie Venn had returned to her flat in the city, though the inspector had made clear she could not leave the country. Margaret Finch had thrown herself into the work of preparing the school for the autumn term with almost manic intensity, as though physical activity might somehow distance her from association with violent death. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had done something that might have appeared innocuous to any observer, but which represented a deliberate strategic choice. She had invited Eleanor Graves, the elderly widow who owned the Victorian terrace house that had been at the center of the business dispute, to tea at her cottage. Eleanor was a woman in her late 70s, sharp-minded despite her years, and possessed of the particular perspective that comes from being tangential to rather than central to village life. As they sat in Miss Marple's small parlor, cups of Darjeeling cooling slightly before them, Eleanor had mentioned something that the inspector had apparently not deemed significant enough to pursue. Jonathan Cross had visited her just 2 days before the party, not to discuss the property matter, but to ask her advice about something of a personal nature. He had seemed troubled, Eleanor said, and had asked her whether she thought it was possible for a man to have made serious mistakes in his life, yet still deserve a chance at redemption. Eleanor Graves's revelation about Jonathan's spiritual questioning hung in the air between them like a note from a musical composition that had not yet resolved itself into harmony. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision and regarded her guest with the kind of gentle attentiveness that encouraged further disclosure. "Did Jonathan specify?" she asked quietly. "What mistakes he believed he had made? Or was he speaking in generalities?" Eleanor considered the question with the deliberateness of someone accustomed to weighing her words. "He spoke of professional matters initially," she said. "Or rather, he began with professional matters. But as our conversation progressed, it became clear that he was troubled by something more personal in nature. He asked me whether I thought people could change, whether patterns established over many years could be fundamentally altered. He seemed almost desperate in his need for reassurance, though he was attempting to conceal this desperation beneath a veneer of casual inquiry. This conversation, which Miss Marple carefully transcribed in her memory with the same meticulous care that she applied to her knitting patterns, suggested a man in the grip of some profound internal crisis, a man contemplating change, examining his own conduct, seeking validation for the possibility of redemption. These were not the preoccupations of someone engaged in simple business disputes or straightforward financial machinations. These were the concerns of someone who had begun to suspect that he had spent years constructing his life upon foundations that were fundamentally unstable, that the edifice of his respectability and success was built upon something that would not withstand scrutiny. When Eleanor had departed, returning to her large and echoing house with the careful steps of the elderly, Miss Marple found herself drawn to a consideration of Dr. Blackwood. She had known Edward Blackwood for nearly 15 years, had watched him transition from an enthusiastic young physician with considerable idealism to a man who seemed progressively more burdened by the weight of knowledge that his profession granted him. Doctors, Miss Marple had observed, often carried with them the exhaustion of knowing too much about their patients, of understanding the physical vulnerabilities that lay beneath their fellow villagers' carefully maintained composures. They became repositories for secrets that patients shared in the semi-confessional atmosphere of the consulting room, secrets that could never be disclosed, but which accumulated in their consciousness like sediment. She decided, therefore, that a visit to Dr. Blackwood's surgery was in order. It was a decision that required some subtlety, as she did not wish to appear to be making inquiries that might suggest she was taking an active interest in the investigation. She manufactured a minor ailment, nothing serious, merely the kind of vague complaint that elderly persons could produce with facility when required, and presented herself at his office on the following afternoon. Dr. Blackwood seemed somewhat surprised to see her, as Miss Marple rarely sought medical attention, believing that most ailments resolved themselves with time and the application of sensible living practices. He conducted his examination with the efficient professionalism that characterized his approach to medicine, and having determined that she was fundamentally in good health, He invited her to sit in his office to discuss her concerns. It was then that Miss Marple, with the kind of conversational skill that had been honed across decades of village life, mentioned that she had been thinking about Jonathan Cross and the circumstances of his death, and that she had found herself wondering what state of mind he must have been in during his final days. Dr. Blackwood's reaction was subtle, but revealing. His hand, which had been resting on his desk, tensed slightly. His eyes, which had been focused on Miss Marple with polite but detached attention, suddenly sharpened. "It's a tragic business," he said carefully. "Jonathan was a patient of mine, though not frequently. He seemed the sort of man who believed that good health could be achieved through force of will rather than through medical attention. Yet you saw him recently, I believe," Miss Marple said, her tone suggesting she was making idle conversation. "He must have been sufficiently concerned about his health to overcome his usual reluctance to consult a physician." Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality of resignation, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask this question and had already prepared his response. "Jonathan came to me with cardiac symptoms," he said. "I recommended specialist evaluation. He seemed resistant to the idea. Not out of fear, precisely, but out of something else. A kind of unwillingness to have his condition formally documented and recorded. As though acknowledging his vulnerability to medical authority would somehow make it more real." "Did he tell you why?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Not directly," Dr. Blackwood replied. "But I have been a physician long enough to recognize when a patient is keeping something from me. Jonathan was frightened, not of death, but of what his medical condition might force him to confront in his life. Sometimes, Miss Marple, people construct their entire existence around the assumption that they have unlimited time. When that assumption is challenged, when mortality becomes something concrete rather than theoretical, everything they have built begins to feel fragile and temporary." Miss Marple nodded slowly, recognizing in this observation the perspective of a man who had glimpsed something significant about Jonathan's state of mind, though he seemed unaware of how completely he had revealed it. She rose to depart, having obtained what she had come to learn, and as she moved toward the door, Dr. Blackwood called after her softly. "Miss Marple," he said, "you don't believe that Richard Ashford killed Jonathan, do you?" She turned, regarding him with her pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than one would expect from someone her age. "I believe," she said carefully, "that we must be very careful about making assumptions based on obvious motives and apparent opportunities. The truth, I have found, is often considerably more complicated and more tragic than our initial suspicions suggest." The investigation, which had been proceeding along its established trajectory with Richard Ashford at its center, was abruptly redirected by a development that no one could have anticipated. A letter was discovered among Jonathan Cross's personal effects, a handwritten missive that had been locked in a drawer of his desk at his office in the market town. The letter was addressed to Richard Ashford and was dated approximately 1 week prior to the murder. Inspector Hawthorne, upon reading it, found his carefully constructed theory beginning to crumble like a structure built upon sand exposed to the tide. The letter, in Jonathan's careful handwriting, contained a confession and an apology. Jonathan acknowledged that he had approached Richard about the property development project not out of genuine business interest, but because he had wished to repair a relationship that he believed he had irreparably damaged years before. He wrote of mistakes made when he was younger, of decisions that had compromised his integrity, and of a growing recognition that he could not continue to live with the weight of these transgressions. He expressed his hope that through working together on the project, he and Richard might develop the kind of trust that would allow him to eventually reveal the nature of his past wrongdoings and seek forgiveness. The letter concluded with a paragraph that seemed to suggest Jonathan's state of mind during his final days. He wrote of having received medical news that had forced him to confront his mortality and of having reached a decision to set his affairs in order, both legally and morally. He indicated that he intended to have a conversation with Richard at the garden party, a conversation that would require considerable courage, but which he believed necessary for his own peace of mind and for the possibility of redemption. This revelation transformed the investigation entirely. It became clear that Jonathan Cross had not been the straightforward man of business that village gossip had constructed, but rather a far more complicated individual burdened by secrets that had accumulated across decades. Inspector Hawthorne's interrogation of Richard Ashford took on a different character, becoming less focused on establishing motive for murder and more concentrated on understanding what Jonathan had wished to reveal. Richard, when confronted with the letter, initially claimed ignorance of its contents. He maintained that Jonathan had attempted to speak with him at the party, had indeed pulled him aside near the hydrangeas, but that their conversation had been interrupted by other guests and had never resumed in any substantive way. What Jonathan had allegedly begun to say, according to Richard's account, pertained to events that had occurred approximately 20 years previous, during a period when Richard had been in his late teenage years and Jonathan had been in his early 30s, establishing himself in the property development business. According to Richard, Jonathan had cryptically referenced a matter involving Richard's late father and some business dealings that had occurred between the two men, but had not had the opportunity to elaborate before being drawn away by conversation with other party guests. Miss Marple, upon learning of this development through the village's efficient gossip network, found herself constructing a new framework within which to organize the facts she had accumulated. Sure, friends, the disamast roan to a wellering consultation, a long to the brain thorougher and wealth did come. Sure aster, a sepis to matic science I. Alex, lineless to the four pantses, which coursed with convocation and brained as a brain. Spent an afternoon in the village library, a small but well-maintained institution housed in the converted basement of the parish hall, consulting property records and business registrations that might illuminate the connection between Jonathan Cross and Richard's late father, Gerald Ashford Sr., who had passed away some 12 years previous. What she discovered was interesting, but incomplete. There had been a business partnership between Jonathan Cross and Gerald Ashford Sr. approximately 20 years previous, a partnership that had apparently dissolved somewhat acrimoniously, resulting in legal proceedings that had ultimately been settled out of court. Armed with this information, Miss Marple composed a letter to Patricia Ashford requesting a private conversation at her earliest convenience. The response came within hours, suggesting that Patricia had been anticipating such an overture. When Miss Marple arrived at the Ashford residence the following morning, she found Patricia in her study, a room that overlooked extensive gardens and suggested a woman of considerable taste and financial resources. "I imagine," Patricia said without preamble, "that you have discovered something about the partnership between my late husband and Jonathan Cross. It was not a matter we discussed publicly, and it certainly is not something I wish to have resurrected at this particular moment." Miss Marple settled herself into the offered chair with the deliberate grace of age. "I wondered," she said gently, "whether your husband and Jonathan might have had a falling out that was never entirely resolved. Whether there might have been unfinished business between them that continued to trouble Jonathan's conscience even after your husband's death." Patricia's expression underwent a subtle alteration, a kind of acceptance settling over her features. She rose and moved to the window, looking out over her gardens with the unseeing gaze of someone examining something in her mind rather than in the physical world. "My husband was not an entirely honest man," she said quietly. "He was honorable in many respects, devoted to his family, conscientious in his legal practice. But in his business dealings with Jonathan, he took advantage of certain circumstances to acquire property under conditions that were not entirely fair. When Jonathan eventually realized what had occurred, he wished to dissolve the partnership. My husband resisted this, and the matter became acrimonious. And did Jonathan hold Richard responsible for his father's conduct? Miss Marple asked. No, Patricia replied. But Richard was a sensitive boy, aware that his father had been engaged in something dishonorable. When Richard and Jonathan encountered each other in adulthood, there was always a certain awkwardness between them. A mutual recognition of a complicated history that neither wished to address directly. I believe Jonathan finally decided to confront it, to explain his actions, and seek some form of reconciliation with Richard as a way of putting to rest a matter that had troubled him for decades. Miss Marple nodded slowly, feeling the shape of the puzzle continuing to shift, revealing new configurations and possibilities. Then, Jonathan did not intend harm toward Richard, she murmured. Quite the contrary. He wished to repair a relationship damaged by his father's actions. Yes, Patricia confirmed. Which makes his death all the more tragic, and Richard's innocence all the more apparent, at least to those willing to see it. The revelation of Jonathan's letter and its implications shifted the investigation into a new and more complex phase. Yet Inspector Hawthorne found himself confronting a peculiar problem. If Richard Ashford was not the murderer, then the question of who had killed Jonathan Cross became substantially more complicated. The obvious motive had dissolved, leaving in its place a landscape of possibilities that seemed to multiply rather than contract as more information emerged. The inspector spent considerable time reviewing his interview notes, searching for details that might have been dismissed as insignificant, but which now, in light of Jonathan's letter, might take on new meaning. It was during this process of reviewing and reassessing that a detail emerged which no one had previously emphasized. When Dr. Blackwood had discovered the body and examined it for vital signs, he had noted that Jonathan's watch had stopped at precisely 1:52. The inspector had initially assumed this to be a result of the violence of the attack, that the watch had been damaged in some way that caused its mechanism to cease functioning. But upon closer examination, Dr. Blackwood now reported that the watch appeared to have been deliberately stopped, that the crystal was intact and the mechanism showed no sign of damage. Someone had wound down the watch and arranged it to display a specific time, which suggested a deliberate attempt to mislead regarding the time of death. This realization forced a reconsideration of the timeline. If the watch had been deliberately set to 1:52, then the actual time of death might have been considerably different from Dr. Blackwood's initial estimate. The doctor, upon further reflection and consultation with medical literature, acknowledged that his estimate of time of death based on body temperature and rigor mortis could have been off by as much as an hour or more. Particularly given the temperature fluctuations within the summer house on a warm afternoon. This meant that Jonathan Cross might have been killed at any point between noon and 3 in the afternoon, a window considerably broader than anyone had previously considered. Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage that evening with her knitting resting untouched in her lap, found herself returning to the question of who had been absent from the main gathering during the crucial period. She recalled with precision the various movements of guests throughout the afternoon, the conversations she had overheard, the momentary absences that people had explained or left unexplained. Sophie Venn had disappeared for a period of approximately 20 minutes midway through the party, mentioning later that she had been using the bathroom and then had stepped into the garden for some quiet reflection. Dr. Blackwood had made a point of moving away from the main gathering, as though the social nature of the event had exhausted his tolerance for interpersonal interaction. Margaret Finch had been present throughout, though there had been moments when she had seemed distracted, her eyes wandering toward the summer house with a quality of observation that suggested more than idle curiosity. What troubled Miss Marple most, however, was a detail that had been mentioned almost in passing by Constance Hartwell during their initial conversation. Constance had remarked that Sophie Venn had appeared unusually nervous during the party, and that Jonathan Cross had seemed to be watching Sophie with an intensity that suggested he wished to speak with her privately. This detail had been subsumed beneath the larger narrative of the business dispute and Richard Ashford's obvious motive. But it now seemed to demand reconsideration. Miss Marple found herself wondering what connection might exist between Jonathan Cross and Sophie Venn, why Jonathan might have wished to speak with her, and whether Sophie's reaction to the discovery of the body had been entirely genuine distress or something more complicated. She determined that a conversation with Sophie was necessary, and accordingly sent a message through the village post office requesting that Sophie telephone her at her earliest convenience. Sophie's response came that evening. She sounded somewhat defensive on the telephone, suggesting that she had anticipated being questioned further and had prepared herself accordingly. When Miss Marple suggested that they might meet for tea the following afternoon, Sophie agreed with a reluctance that was palpable even across the telephone line. The meeting took place in Miss Marple's sitting room, a space that had been carefully arranged to suggest both comfort and a certain formality that encouraged honest conversation. Sophie was dressed in her usual city attire, a professional ensemble that seemed to armor her against the gentleness of village life. She perched on the edge of the offered chair as though prepared to flee at any moment. "I wondered," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with the deliberateness that suggested she had all the time in the world, "whether you might have known Jonathan Cross prior to his arrival in Ashford. Your reaction to his death seemed particularly intense, more so than one might expect from someone who merely encountered him at a social gathering." Sophie's hand trembled slightly as she accepted the offered cup. "I knew him slightly," she admitted after a moment of hesitation. "Through my mother, actually. When she was practicing medicine, Jonathan came to her with some health concerns. She referred him to a specialist in the city. That was years ago, before my mother retired. Yet at the party, Miss Marple observed gently, Jonathan seemed to wish to speak with you. Did he succeed in having a private conversation with you?" Sophie's face colored slightly. "He asked if we might talk privately. I agreed, thinking he wished to inquire about my mother's health or something of that nature. But when we stepped away from the main group, near the hydrangeas, he seemed to become suddenly uncertain. He kept beginning sentences and then stopping himself, as though he wished to say something but found it difficult to articulate. Eventually, he simply apologized for the interruption and returned to the party." "Did he give any indication of what he wished to discuss?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Sophie was quiet for a considerable time, her eyes fixed on her teacup. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "He said he owed me an apology for something that had occurred in the past, something he had only recently come to understand the full implications of. He said he needed to speak with my mother as well, to make things right if possible. I told him my mother was in poor health and that I did not believe any conversation about past matters would be helpful to her. He seemed to accept this, though he looked terribly sad when I said it. The mention of Sophie's mother opened a door that had remained closed throughout the investigation, and Miss Marple found herself possessed of a sudden clarity regarding the shape of Jonathan Cross's history and the secrets that had driven him toward confession and reconciliation. She thanked Sophie for her honesty and noted the younger woman's evident relief at having finally disclosed something that had clearly been weighing upon her conscience. Once Sophie had departed, Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon engaged in a series of telephone calls to various contacts, inquiries that were framed with such apparent innocence that no one could have suspected they were part of a systematic investigation into Jonathan's past. What emerged from these conversations was a picture of a man who had spent decades carrying guilt for actions taken in his youth. Actions that had affected others in ways he was only beginning to fully comprehend. Sophie's mother, Dr. Margaret Venn, had been Jonathan's physician during a period approximately 25 years previous, when he had suffered a minor cardiac episode that had forced him to confront his own mortality for the first time. It was during this period that Jonathan had allegedly made an investment in a property development scheme that Dr. Venn had believed to be a sound opportunity. Jonathan had convinced her to invest a substantial sum of money that she had intended for her daughter's education. The investment had failed spectacularly, resulting in the loss of nearly all of Dr. Venn's capital. The most damning detail, which Miss Marple extracted through careful conversation with Eleanor Graves, who remembered the scandal from decades past, was that Jonathan had known the investment was unsound before suggesting it to Dr. Venn. He had promoted it to her precisely because he had needed her capital to prevent his own financial collapse, and he had deliberately concealed the risks involved. Dr. Venn had eventually recovered financially through her successful medical practice, but the betrayal had left a wound that had never entirely healed. Sophie's difficult relationship with her mother in recent years, the tension that existed between them despite their surface civility, stemmed from Dr. Venn's conviction that her daughter's present struggles were a direct result of the lost educational opportunities that Jonathan's deception had created. This discovery reframed everything. Jonathan Cross had not been merely a troubled man seeking to repair damaged relationships with those like Richard Ashford and Patricia Ashford's late husband. He had been someone haunted by the recognition that his early ruthlessness had had consequences that rippled through decades, affecting people's lives in ways both obvious and subtle. His medical diagnosis of cardiac problems had apparently triggered a comprehensive reckoning with his past, a kind of spiritual accounting that had made it impossible for him to continue living as though these transgressions had never occurred. Inspector Hawthorne, when Miss Marple shared this information with him during a carefully arranged conversation at the police station, found himself obliged to acknowledge that the investigation had taken on dimensions considerably beyond the scope of a simple crime of passion. The question was no longer who had sufficient motive to kill Jonathan Cross, as it became increasingly apparent that numerous people harbored resentments against him. The question instead became who had the specific knowledge, the particular emotional state, and the opportunity to commit the murder at the precise moment that Jonathan had positioned himself in the summer house. Vulnerable and alone. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple made a suggestion to the inspector that seemed almost casual in its delivery, but which would prove to be the pivot upon which the entire case would turn. She mentioned, with the kind of offhand observation that characterized her conversational style, that she had been wondering about Dr. Blackwood's relationship with Jonathan Cross, and whether there might have been some personal connection beyond the simple doctor-patient relationship that had been previously disclosed. She noted that Dr. Blackwood's behavior since the murder had been peculiar, marked by a kind of anxious distraction that suggested he knew something more about the crime than he had revealed. Inspector Hawthorne's subsequent interview with Dr. Blackwood, conducted with considerably more intensity and specificity than previous questioning, eventually broke through the doctor's carefully maintained composure. Dr. Blackwood admitted, after considerable resistance, that he had known Jonathan Cross in medical school, decades before their paths had crossed again in Ashford in the Vale. They had been close friends during their university years, until Jonathan had stolen a significant sum of money from Edward's lodgings in order to fund his early business ventures. The theft had gone unpunished because Edward, fearing scandal and believing that Jonathan's ambitions might eventually allow him to repay the money, had never reported it to authorities. Edward had eventually recovered the money, but the betrayal had poisoned their friendship permanently. What had troubled Edward most was not the theft itself, but rather Jonathan's apparent indifference to the harm he had caused. his ability to simply move forward as though the transgression was of no consequence. When Jonathan had returned to Ashford in the Vale, Edward had experienced a resurrection of these old wounds. A reminder of a period in his life when he had been taken advantage of by someone he had trusted completely. Most significantly, Edward had come to understand that Jonathan's pattern of behavior toward him had not been unique, that Jonathan had likely exploited numerous people throughout his life in pursuit of his financial ambitions. He contacted me before the party, Dr. Blackwood finally revealed, his voice hollow with the exhaustion of suppressed emotion. He wished to apologize, to attempt to make restitution. I refused to see him. I told him that some betrayals were too fundamental to be addressed through simple apologies and financial compensation. I told him that he had built his entire life upon the suffering of others, and that no amount of late-life contrition could change that fundamental truth. Miss Marple received news of Dr. Blackwood's confession through the village's efficient communication network, though the details that circulated through Ashford in the Vale in the hours following his arrest were considerably more muddled and speculative than the actual facts of the case. By evening, the village had constructed its own narrative, one in which Dr. Blackwood had been driven to madness by some unspecified grievance, in which Jonathan Cross had been either a victim of medical incompetence or a man who had deserved his fate for reasons that no one could quite articulate. Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage with her knitting resting untouched in her lap, found herself contemplating the nature of community judgment and the ways in which villages constructed moral narratives around events that they did not fully understand. She had expected, in a certain sense, that the investigation would conclude with Dr. Blackwood's arrest. The evidence had pointed in his direction with increasing clarity once one knew where to look. Once one understood that Jonathan's pattern of deception extended back decades into relationships that Dr. Blackwood had maintained with apparent equanimity, but which had, in fact, festered beneath the surface of their professional civility. Yet what troubled Miss Marple was not the solution to the crime, but rather the broader implications of the case. The uncomfortable recognition that Jonathan Cross had been a man of considerable complexity, neither purely villain nor purely victim of his own moral limitations. The following morning, she found herself walking through the village with a purpose that seemed aimless to any observer, though in fact she was conducting a final round of observations and conversations that would allow her to construct a complete understanding of the events that had led to Jonathan's death. She paused at Eleanor Graves's house and was invited in for a cup of tea, a beverage that Eleanor seemed to believe could address virtually any social or emotional circumstance. As they sat in Eleanor's drawing room, surrounded by furniture that had accumulated across decades of careful curation, Eleanor expressed her uncertainty about the case's resolution. "I cannot help but feel," Eleanor said carefully, "that there is something incomplete about the explanation that has been provided. Dr. Blackwood certainly had motive, and his confession seems genuine. Yet I wonder whether Jonathan's visit to me just days before his death was truly motivated solely by his attempts at reconciliation. He seemed to be wrestling with something more fundamental than the desire to apologize for past transgressions." Miss Marple regarded her hostess with genuine interest. "What impression did you have of his state of mind?" she asked gently. Eleanor was quiet for a considerable time, her fingers wrapped around her teacup as though drawing warmth from it despite the warmth of the day. He seemed like a man who had come to understand that his life, viewed in totality, might not have been worth the price that others had paid for his success. He asked me whether I thought redemption was possible for someone who had spent decades in pursuit of wealth and status at the expense of others' well-being. I assured him that I believed redemption was always possible, but I wonder now whether my assurances were anything more than the platitudes of someone who has never been forced to contemplate such questions seriously. This conversation, combined with what Miss Marple had learned from her various inquiries and observations, began to crystallize into a more complete picture of Jonathan Cross than the one that had emerged through the investigation. Jonathan had not been a man of simple villainy. nor had he been entirely the victim of his own moral weaknesses. Rather, he had been someone trapped within patterns of behavior that had been established in his youth. Patterns that had become so ingrained in his character that he could not imagine alternative ways of existing in the world until his health crisis had forced a reconsideration of his entire existence. Miss Marple walked to the church, as she often did on mornings when she wished to think clearly, and found herself sitting in the quiet sanctuary, her eyes fixed on the memorial plaques that lined the walls. These plaques represented the accumulated weight of village history, the lives of those who had lived in Ashford and had left some mark upon the place, however small. She thought about Jonathan Cross's name, which would not appear on any such plaque, whose memory would fade gradually from the village consciousness as other dramas and scandals replaced him in the collective narrative. She thought about Dr. Blackwood, now confined in custody, his life effectively concluded despite his continued biological existence. It was then that she found herself considering whether the investigation had in fact captured the complete truth of what had occurred in the summer house that afternoon. Dr. Blackwood's confession seemed genuine, yet there was something in his account that troubled her in ways she could not entirely articulate. She had spent 80 years observing human behavior, and she had learned that confession, even when apparently sincere, could be shaped by various psychological needs and desires. A person might confess to a crime not solely because they had committed it, but because they had wished to commit it, because they had imagined it in such vivid detail that the imagined crime and the actual crime had become merged in their consciousness. She made a decision that would have seemed unusual to anyone observing her, though in fact it was entirely consistent with her methodology of investigation. She requested a private meeting with Dr. Blackwood in his cell, and Inspector Hawthorne, though puzzled by the request, granted it on the basis of Miss Marple's considerable reputation and the respect she had earned through her careful contributions to the investigation thus far. When she finally sat across from Dr. Blackwood in that austere space, she regarded him with eyes that seemed capable of perceiving truths that others might miss, and she asked him a single question with such gentleness that it took him a moment to understand the implications of what she was asking. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, "did you actually strike the blow that killed Jonathan Cross, or did you merely believe that you had?" Inspector Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, regarding Dr. Blackwood with the expression of someone who had been conducting an investigation for several days and had finally arrived at the moment of critical revelation. The question that now hung between them was not whether Dr. Blackwood had possessed motive to kill Jonathan Cross, as this had become abundantly clear, but rather whether he had possessed the specific opportunity, and whether his emotional state at the time of the murder was such that he could have committed an act of violence with the calculated deliberation that the crime suggested. "You attended the garden party," the inspector said quietly. "You were present when Jonathan arrived. Walk me through your movements that afternoon." Dr. Blackwood seemed to have aged considerably in the past few minutes, as though the act of finally admitting the depth of his resentment toward Jonathan had somehow drained the remaining vitality from his frame. He spoke with the careful precision of a man recounting events that he had mentally rehearsed numerous times, scenarios that he had constructed and reconstructed in his mind until they had taken on the quality of established fact. "I saw Jonathan arrive," he began. "I watched him speak briefly with Mrs. Hartwell, and then I observed him moving toward the summer house. I thought at first that he was merely seeking a quiet space away from the social interaction. But then I realized that he was likely waiting for someone, that he intended to have a private conversation. I found myself wondering who it might be, and whether his purpose was genuinely reconciliatory as he had suggested in his letter to me, or whether he was manipulating someone else as he had manipulated so many people throughout his life." "Did you follow him?" the inspector asked. "I did," Dr. Blackwood admitted. "Not immediately. But after a few minutes had passed, I told myself that I merely wished to confront him, to make clear that his apologies and attempts at restitution were utterly insufficient, that they could not undo the damage he had caused. I went to the summer house intending only to speak with him, to have one final conversation in which I could articulate the full extent of what his betrayal had meant to me. "And did you have that conversation?" the inspector pressed. Dr. Blackwood's hands, which had been resting on the table before him, began to tremble slightly. "Yes and no," he said. "When I entered the summer house, Jonathan was sitting on the chaise longue. He seemed unsurprised to see me, as though he had been expecting me. He stood, and he began to speak, to offer his apologies once again. But as he spoke, I found myself experiencing a kind of fury that I had not anticipated, a rage that seemed to emanate from some deep place within me that I had believed I had long since made peace with. He was explaining how he had come to understand the harm he had caused, how his recent health concerns had forced him to confront the reality of his own mortality, and I found myself thinking that this was precisely the sort of self-serving narrative that Jonathan had always constructed. A story in which he was the protagonist struggling toward redemption, rather than the antagonist who had caused genuine suffering. The inspector remained silent, allowing Dr. Blackwood to continue at his own pace, recognizing that confession often required a kind of narrative flow that interrupted resistance. "The paperweight was on the table," Dr. Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I had not consciously decided to use it as a weapon, but as Jonathan continued to speak, to offer his explanations and his apologies, I found myself reaching for it. I told him that his words meant nothing, that his attempts at redemption were merely another form of the selfishness that had characterized his entire life. He seemed to understand, in that final moment, what was about to happen. He did not attempt to defend himself. He simply looked at me with an expression of profound sadness, as though he had expected this outcome all along, as though he had recognized that some consequences could not be avoided regardless of one's intentions. "You struck him," the inspector said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I did," Dr. Blackwood confirmed. "Once, with considerable force. He fell immediately. I realized almost at once what I had done, what I had become through the act of violence. I wiped the paperweight clean of fingerprints, more from some instinctive desire to conceal what had occurred than from any rational plan. I stepped out of the summer house and returned to the gathering as though nothing had happened. I stopped Jonathan's watch at 1:52 because I wished the police to be confused about the time of death, to give myself additional time to establish an alibi and to gather my thoughts. Inspector Hawthorne made a note in his file, his expression unchanged, though there was something in his bearing that suggested a kind of resigned sadness at the confirmation of what he had suspected. "Dr. Blackwood," he said formally, "I must inform you that you are being detained on suspicion of the murder of Jonathan Cross. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used as evidence against you." It was only after Dr. Blackwood had been processed and placed in custody that Inspector Hawthorne found himself considering the peculiar nature of justice and the complicated ways in which human beings responded to betrayal and the prospect of redemption. He understood, intellectually, that Dr. Blackwood had committed a murder, that his actions had been deliberate and violent, regardless of whether they had been premeditated in the strict legal sense. Yet he also understood that Jonathan Cross had spent decades causing harm, had built his life upon the suffering of others, and had only in his final years begun to recognize the consequences of his actions. The inspector found himself hoping that Dr. Blackwood would receive some measure of mercy from the courts, though he knew such hope was likely naive. Dr. Blackwood's face underwent a subtle transformation as Miss Marple posed her question, a kind of collapse inward that suggested the careful structure he had constructed around his confession was beginning to fracture. He sat in silence for a considerable length of time, his hands folded before him on the metal table, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Miss Marple's shoulder, as though he were examining something in his memory that only he could perceive. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quality of someone admitting to a truth that he had been reluctant to face even in his own consciousness. I entered the summer house with the explicit intention of confronting him. Dr. Blackwood began slowly. I was filled with rage, genuine and profound rage that seemed to emanate from every cell of my body. When I saw him sitting there, when I heard him begin his apologies, I felt something shift within me, something that felt almost murderous. I reached for the paperweight. I held it in my hand, and I experienced a moment in which I could see, with perfect clarity, what it would be like to strike him down, to watch him fall, to have the satisfaction of violence enacted upon someone who had betrayed me so fundamentally. He paused, his jaw tightening as though the recollection required considerable effort to articulate. But I did not strike him, he continued. In that moment, as I stood there with the paperweight in my hand, I looked into his face, and I saw not the man who had stolen from me, not the man who had built his life upon exploitation and deception, but rather a man who was genuinely afraid. Not afraid of me, not afraid of violence, but afraid of death, afraid of the judgment that awaited him, afraid of the reality that his attempts at redemption would never be sufficient to undo the harm he had caused. And in seeing that fear, I found that my rage dissipated, that I could not bring myself to add another act of violence to the accumulation of harms that already existed between us. "What happened then?" Miss Marple asked gently, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I set the paperweight down," Dr. Blackwood said. "I told him that I could not forgive him, that his apologies meant nothing to me, that he had destroyed something in me that could never be repaired." I turned and left the summer house. I returned to the party and attempted to behave as though nothing had occurred. But as I was standing near the refreshment table, perhaps 10 minutes later, I heard the screaming begin. Someone had discovered his body. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though this confirmation of her suspicion merely confirmed what she had already determined through observation and deduction. "You did not kill him," she said. "Yet you confessed to the crime. Why?" Dr. Blackwood's eyes finally focused on Miss Marple's face, and she observed in them a kind of desperate relief, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask this question, and to provide him with the opportunity to explain his seemingly inexplicable actions. "Because I realized, when I learned of his death, that I had spent so many years imagining such an outcome that the imagined act and the actual act had become indistinguishable in my mind. I had wanted to kill him so intensely, I had fantasized about it so vividly, that when the opportunity for violence was denied to me by the intervention of my own conscience, I found that I could not tolerate the continuation of a life in which Jonathan Cross remained alive and moving through the world, causing further harm, seeking redemption that he did not deserve." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When I confessed, I was confessing not to an act that I had committed, but to an act that I had wished to commit. To an act that I had rehearsed in my mind so many times that it had achieved a kind of psychological reality that seemed more genuine than the actual events of that afternoon. I believed that my confession would provide closure, that it would allow me to accept the consequences of my desire for violence, even though my conscience had prevented me from acting upon that desire." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate and careful, as they always were. She regarded Dr. Blackwood with an expression that combined both compassion and a kind of clinical assessment of the human condition. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, "your confession, while sincere in its emotional truthfulness, is not a confession to the murder of Jonathan Cross. The question therefore remains, who did kill him, and why did they do so?" She left the cell and made her way back through the police station to Inspector Hawthorne's office, where she found the inspector reviewing case files with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to investigation. She sat across from him and, in her gentle but utterly clear manner, explained what Dr. Blackwood's interview had revealed. The inspector's expression shifted from confusion to comprehension as he began to grasp the implications of her explanation. "If Dr. Blackwood did not kill him," Hawthorne said slowly, "then we must reconsider the entire timeline of events. We must re-examine who had both motive and opportunity. And we must consider what Dr. Blackwood's presence in the summer house might have obscured regarding the actual sequence of events." Miss Marple nodded, and together they began the process of reconstructing the afternoon of the murder with this new understanding. As they worked through the details, a new picture began to emerge, one that required them to reconsider the actions and movements of another party entirely. Someone whose guilt had been obscured by the convenient emergence of Dr. Blackwood's confession, and by the village's eagerness to identify a culprit and return to the comfortable routines of ordinary life.